welcome on behalf of DURA to this evening with SimonJenner and W.N. Herbert. Sorry, may I call you Bill? Okay, because So, to make the introductions, first of all, SimonJenner. Simon was educated at Leeds, then Cambridge, where his PhD was, strangely enough, on Oxford poetry of the 1940s. Almost uniquely, his David came with 2 bilingual volumes published in Germany in 1996 and 97, and parallel texts in English and German. Prior to this, he undertook poetry tours in Germany, was awarded a South East Arts bursary and a Royal Literary Fund grants, and regularly appeared on BBC between 1999 and 2003. The bilingual volumes From Head to Foot and Player Time appeared in 1996 and 97, and in 1999 received a South East Arts, sorry I've already said that. His British debut collection, About Bloody Time, appeared in 2006 and was published by Waterloo Press. He has subsequently published Long Evenings and most recently Two for Joy, also by Waterloo. He has written a volume extending the imaginative heteronyms of Fernando Pessoa and his circle, alarmingly people like Alistair Crowley. So I'm not going to get on the wrong side of you tonight, I think. Anyway, so this was in 2010, where Simon was poet, this was launched at the Embassy in June 2010, where Simon was poet in the city, and that body appointed him poet in residence at Hackney County Archives. Okay. Simon has been director of Survivors Poetry since 2003, and from 2008 to 10, there's an awful lot of dates here, I think I'll ditch some of the dates. He has been a Royal Literary Fund Fellow at the Universities of East London and Chichester, where he is currently working on his 1940s study and a biography of Lionel Johnson. His poetry and articles appear in Agenda, Angel Exhaust, PN Review, and other respected periodicals. Peter Porter commented in a thoroughly admirable way, "This work is miles from the prevailing styles admired in this country at the moment." And Robert Nye predicted a considerable new poet on the scene, and his best work is yet to come. He is, of course, at the helm of Waterloo Press in Hove. W.N. Herbert, more usually known as Bill. W.N. is Dundee born and is, of course, our very own Macker. After Oxford and his doctorate in the work of Hugh McDermott, Bill returned to residencies in Scotland, published as To Sir Jack McDermott in 1992. After residencies near his home soil, he became Northern Arts Literary Fellow at Newcastle and Durham Universities between 1994 and 96. Bill was one of 20 poets featured in the Poetry Society's New Generation Poets promotion in 1994. He held residences with Cumbria Arts in Education and the Wordsworth Trust at Dove Cottage in Grasmere. And he lectured in the Department of Creative Writing at Lancaster University from 1996 to 2002. He is currently Professor of Poetry and Creative Writing at Newcastle University. Bill's collections include The Testament of the Reverend Thomas Dick and 5 books published by Blood Axe: Forked Tongue, Cabaret McGonagall, The Lorlude, The Big Bumper Book of Troy, and Bad Shame and Blues. Cabaret McGonagall was shortlisted for the Forward Poetry Prize, Best Collection, and the McVitie's Prize in the Scottish Writer of the Year, and received a Scottish Artists' Council Book Award, as did Forked Tongue and The Lorlude. In 1983, he launched the poetry magazine The Gairfish. The anthology Strong Words, Modern Poets and Modern Poetry, which he co-edited, was published in 2000. He edited and contributed to a Balkan exchange, 8 poets from Bulgaria and Britain, and co-translated the poems of a Somali poet, and I'm going to ask you to pronounce that in case I get it wrong.
Mohammed Rashid Damak Garia. Garia is the kind of the nickname that the poets were given. I think Garia meant something like slow. He was the fastest thinker I ever met. So the Somali nicknames are all deeply ironic and sardonic.
Thank you, and I'm very glad you pronounced that for me. I was very worried about that. He has been described as prolific and fluent poet by Lilias Fraser, and a brilliant, notorious maverick. Most recently, he has published the remarkable and challenging Amnesia in 2 parts, and has co-edited the Whaleback City anthology with Andy Jackson. He is prolific in both Scots and English. But really, his most recent publication that I'm aware of came under a layer of grease and a pie at Dens. How good is that? So thank you. Would you give them a warm thank you? I trust that both of you will be forgiving of the many omissions in these bios. I fear had I done justice to your many achievements, we would have been left with no time for anything else tonight. So two prolific, diverse and exciting poets, it is a privilege to share this evening with them. In truth, their work is very different. What may be the links? Both men are hugely erudite and elusive in their work. However, their wordplay and referencing is both joyous and fun. Both poets take their ludic responsibilities very seriously. That's for later, when their work can speak for itself. And you, the audience, will have the chance to ask them directly about their verse. The first part of this evening is about the vexed matter of poetry editing and publishing. Now, I know this audience has quite a few practicing poets and writers in it. So, Bill, would that be a smear of peers in your works? So I expect some very lively and committed contributions when the discussion is open to the floor. But just thinking about this, publishing is in recognisably difficult times. The increasing electronic market and so much more is impacting. Leaving aside the truly thrilling and necessarily digital developments in experimental use of hypertext and the like in poetry, for so many of us, a poetry book is a very precious thing. Something more tactile, perhaps less transient than cyberspace. So, how is poetry publishing faring in comparison with other forms, and how should it move forward into the 21st century? So that's a big question, and I don't mind which of you takes it on board first.
Well, I suppose I would defer to Simon because he's a publisher. In this matter, I am the mere raw material, the extruded sausage awaiting its skin in such matters. You know, and so my take on it is only that the diversity is not going to go back in the box. It's not going to simplify. We have to consider publishing as something that is going to have an electronic form, that is going to be in books, that is going to be, perhaps for poetry, increasingly in small editions, in books which are themselves attractive and important, works of book making, and this is the way that poetry will continue to go forward in itself, is simply by embracing each piece of technology. The book was a piece of technology, the poem managed to handle that. It got from the scroll to the book somehow, and so too it will survive the internet. It needs to work out if it's publishing or not. That's one of the great problems. You get stuff appearing on in webzines and on websites, and people seem still quite sharply divided as to whether it actually counts as publishing or it is in some kind of strange in-between status. I think that anything where the public can see your work is publishing, and therefore should be treated as such and given due respect.
Well, it's true, because poetry competitions themselves, say it can't be seen on the net, it can't be this, that, and the other. They are defined in a sense, and those loci of guardians of our sensibilities have actually decided for us, effectively, what is published and what isn't. So I totally agree with Bill on that. As regards to what's happening in publishing at the moment, there's a bifurcation. A long time ago, fellow writer David Kendall pointed out that it's the small presses that have got to produce the beautiful book. If anyone remembers Trigger and Cress, it's one of the beautiful, they produce stuff of an immaculate, as I say, one might say, conception. It had flaps, it had an extraordinary valency and permanence. Jonathan Capey and stuff in the 70s along that line. But when I tried flaps, they said, we can't afford that. So I said, well, okay, why not flip a dust jacket off like that, put a bare bat, a simply unprimed back, and simply cover it like that, and that actually doesn't cost very much money at all. But it looks good, and people like it. And David's point that presses have to become more attractive in that respect than, I'm talking about smaller presses here. It's part of the way that poetry is disseminated. One thinks of the way that Donne or Johnson would have been disseminating their poetry in rather beautiful or otherwise manuscripts. On the other side, you've got, this is where Gail and I and everybody met DURA in a way, as it was just about to become at this conference in Glasgow in 2011, and that was about the future of the e-book. And one thing that was decided pretty clearly was that no one form was going to exclude the other. There were several points that happened. One was that poetry is actually quite difficult to put up on e-books. The formatting on Kindle had quite a few challenges ahead of it. Leanpub and one or two other platforms that have a multi-platform potential, you can put them up on iPads and so forth, have allowed that sort of basically a leeway towards getting you books, e-books that are going to be looked at everywhere else. But there was no way that the printed book was going to be replaced by the e-book. The other thing that's happened is that I've had experience, one of the books over there, this is our sort of big trust for Scottish Publishing, the Cloud volume we did in 2009, the first of our two Joseph Cloud volumes. Recently it's come out on Kindle and on Leanpub, but in a slightly different form, in the sense that otherwise it's the same book, but the editorial matter has been extended by Andrew Duncan, who had an enthusiastic take on the fact that e-books can go on forever. I don't know how much forever, I haven't even seen what we've done to it, but it's a slightly different book. I think the big thing is that poetry, printing, publishing and dissemination, the book, the movement from litho, if we want to get technical about this, where you used to, pile out copies of 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 at a time, is gone. You get print runs of 100. Syrian Press, I know, only do 800 max, some of their biggest people. Quite a lot of the Faber runs are down to 1,000 or so. And when some of the bigger poets, I will not mention them, have a print run, I've actually been told that one of the T.S. Eliot award winners, I'm talking about somebody who was a well-known poet, not one of the surprise winners, their actual sales was 700. We're talking about a remarkably small franchise, and it's very, very different to what it was. And in a sense, the risk-taking, the print-on-demand factor, that is, you could, set up a little PDF and every day pay a small fee, and you can run off a number of books. Even that's changing. Small print runs. We do sometimes. We've got a very large book of Alessandro Pisani, a great Argentinian poet, and it's such an epic great doorstopper in a book of 300 pages that to print that on our margins when we're always owing the printer something is actually quite dangerous. So we actually get round to thinking we'll get another 12 orders in the next 4 months, or actually get a lot more than that. But at one point we printed just 12 copies. And that's how it's going for a lot of people. E-books, small runs, and that survival means that every book we have doesn't ever go out of print. So, and that's just for us. Pertica Press, example of another one with small presses. They produce these beautifully tailored books. I wanted 30, and they've just sent me 10. Can you send me out 10? They put them in the print run on Thursday, and they came up here on Monday. So there is that change, and there's that shift in targeting your readership, and not having, say, a very large warehouse of mulching books. And that I think makes the sense of the target audience, as they would call it, and the availability and appetite for poetry, something very particular and very personal.
That's very interesting. This kind of leads on as well. Bill, you made some very interesting comments in an earlier interview in connection with Amnesia, in which you described yourself as being bored with the conventional 60-page poetry book, which is challenging, exciting, and publishing-wise perhaps that's equivalent to its attack on the pentameter. It's an exciting thought, and one I think a lot of us who like to work in different media and different forums will readily understand. But in this room there's a whole lot of people who are awfully pleased if you can get your one poem or whatever in a respected journal. We don't have the negotiating power that you have, I guess. So challenging a publisher in that 60-page format is maybe a dream away. And I think, somebody said, I can offer you a 60-page collection tonight. There'd be this terrible sound of arms being chewed off. And so I'd like to hear both poets' sort of further thoughts on this.
I suppose the note of caution that I was sounding there is to do with refers to what what Simon's saying, in a way that poetry is infinitely adaptable. It will not sell in any form. So it doesn't really matter which way you come around at it. There will still be a very small percentage of people who are actively and keenly seeking it out. But nonetheless, it's important, I think, to think about those forms which are entirely to do with the convenience of publishing rather than to do with some immutable law about poetry. There isn't a particularly definite pattern that says that poets think entirely in 64-page units. That's something that publishers do. There isn't something that says that small print runs are the exquisite solution. That's something which publishers are prepared to pay out for and no more. There isn't something that says poems ought to be about 40 lines long because that's dead good. That's more to do with the fact that when people are judging competitions, they can't bear to read anything longer than 40 lines when they've got 5,000 of them stacked up in envelopes. And so we really have to distinguish between a notion which is that aesthetic economy in poetry is an absolutely unalloyed good thing. And the other fact, which is that is what publishers require of us because poetry does not sell. The return is so small. They can't bear to have a larger edition, they can't bear to have more pages, they can't bear to have longer poems because they'll just go out of business. So poetry is always a kind of a daring to do something beyond what's practical. Poetry in its essence is the same kind of daring. We're asking that of language, so why shouldn't we ask it of the publishing industry when we do something? So the position that I was in with asking for more than a 64-page book, well, it was kind of a reaction against the tendency to treat these things as some kind of aesthetic fact, and therefore to produce work that is quietist, that is lyrical, that is anecdotal, that reflects sort of carefully on epiphanic moments which seem to happen with great regularity to that poet. I just sort of thought, well, I read a lot of these books and I'm kind of get a bit bored after a bit because it's all on the same note, and that's because they're not resisting the grain of publishing. They're not going against the possibilities. Now, yeah, I managed to persuade my publisher, I think only for the one time, to produce 2 enormous books which kind of reflected each other in various ways, which we'll talk about later. But he was extremely reluctant to do so. It wasn't like, I really had to make a kind of theoretic case rather than a financial case, because there is no financial case for doing such a thing. And I think we just have to really accept that most poetry occurs outside the economy. When we began publishing, Forbes and Neil and us were going up to use George Galloway's Gestetner machine somewhere up a close and producing these horrible mangled pages of really rather good work. We thought, and it didn't sell either. It's always an act of resistance, and whether you're doing it from a position of power or a position of powerlessness, you must maintain that resistance.
True. We've had that thrown at us quite a bit. We produce books. I noticed Bill's managed to keep up 160 pages at least recently, and I thought, well, I can do that. And so I threw a lot of my work in. But it's true that when we came to several of our volumes, we were looking at 300 pages as absolutely essential for that volume. And it's quite true that I do find quietist epiphanic. I know exactly what Bill means. And it's redolent of not only the workshops, it's also redolent of several other things, of the accessibility, I can read this through in one evening. And it's not just the commercial, but also, for instance, and we are relatively dependent on them, we've had them for a long time, they're very nice people, the Arts Council, and they talk about access. And they really want you to maximise your access. And that, unfortunately, means that what they want there is proof that a greater range of readership will accrue. And I remember something that Hugo Williams said on a chat show based in about 2001, I think it was. And he was saying to people who were getting quite excited about this is going to be the new moment for poetry. Look, I was 17 in 1959 and we all thought something was going to happen, which is very, very big. I was there in Albert Hall in 65 with the Holy Communion and the Michael Horowitz event. And that was about as big as it got, largely because you were finally allowed to abuse the government, and that's usually the best way to drag in new readership. But the point was that was the high point of, in terms of the numbers and the access. It's not that poetry is inaccessible, and it's not that Horowitz, as he often adopts the phrase, that it's because most people ignore poetry because poetry ignores most people. It's because there's always been a sort of level interest, and it's never very, very much changed. But and I agree again entirely with Bill on this, it's about the kind of music they want you to listen to, or the music bouncing off the walls. And what they want to listen to is a very tight and slightly limited and anodyne material sometimes that really doesn't have that bones in it. You want something that's going to last 80 lines. People's attention span has shrunk. I mean, it's gone down from, you can't read. I mean, I commute, so I can read all the long poems in English and quite a few other things on the train. And I think it's the only way you can read them now, because you don't get enough permission to do it otherwise. But people did have a longer periodicity of reading. That's changed. And people's attention spans have shortened. But I think we have to resist that. We have to say, yes, you should be able to read 160 pages. And having got a massive headache from reading for a 98-page book and a 68-page book last night until 2 in the morning, which really gave me almost a hangover, I can think, well, at least I've tried. But I do feel that those elements are very much part of the process of our experience of reading. It's part of that, it's part of the culture, it's part of the funding culture, as well as part of the commercial culture. Everything is vectoring in and saying, this is all you have to do, not much bigger than one of these things, 10 more poems and you're done. So yeah, I think that's just one of the things that we're looking at.
I'd like to draw it in a bit closer now. I mean, you both have great experience of wearing your editorial hats, and I'd like to put them on now. So I'm thinking about things like Helena Nelson's marvellous How Not to Get Your Poetry Published. And at the Poets' Compass conference in June, Jay Cambridge of the Dark Horse said that his heart sinks when he receives a submission of 100 poems, all done in the last 6 months. He urged people to leave their poetry aside for 6 months, let it mature, then submit. So I'm very interested in your feelings about that, because it was a very strong mission statement.
I've got a horrible admission. I've just produced an agenda volume. Sorry, it's just balmy personal. I had about 30 or 40 poems of music, or 50 poems. And last year I wrote, actually, for the first time in my life, having written one poem in 05, 100 poems. So I did submit this as a PBS write-up, an agenda volume with actually 100, well, not 100 new poems, but something like about, actually 80 poems which were new. So that was a bit frightening. But yeah, sorry, I didn't want to jump in.
No, not at all, please.
The appearance of that is basically, do they send a stamped addressed envelope? I have got somebody called, is a wonderful man, M. Courtney Soper, lovely person. He sends me poems that he seems to have put into the washing machine, and they're crumbling, and they're like ancient papyri, and I put them in a little plastic thing, and I send them back to him occasionally, but then I realise that he's a survivor of mental illness, and my other hat survivors poetry, so I actually think, oh, it's all right, I can publish him in there. So I sort of put him up, and actually I type them up myself, painstakingly, put them up on the screen, and publish them on the web. But I did get things like that through the post, and we do, and Bill's seen this a lot. In fact, he had, I think I only said he was 6 that time for Gairfish, I did actually. And you published one too. But you get that all the time, and you just have to put them in the watch and send them back, gently. But there are several things that have been said, the centering of the text. You can see on the first page whether you're going to be reading it. Perhaps the worst experience is that this person is relatively competent, they've been to a writing class, they've had various endorsements, and you know that you've got to take them seriously, and they have still written 100 poems. I won't say more, but yes, that's been one of the terrorising factors. But usually people are well behaved. You don't get that very often nowadays.
I don't really have anything to add to that, other than that I did judge the National Poetry Competition the other year, where we had 13,500 entries delivered in 9 boxes that were like squares from the pyramid, from the Great Pyramid. And you knew as soon as you looked at the page, not that it wasn't a good poem or a bad poem, but simply that it couldn't win that competition. And the one thing that became evident the more you turned the page, and that was whether it was because it was centred or it had little doilies of flowers all around it, or it was written in a typewriter that only had several keys really functioning. There was all sorts of signs why that happened, but the crucial factor was that you knew that the person who sent that in had no realistic picture of what was going to happen to their work. They hadn't thought about the audience that work was going to at all. It was the case that I had slightly more idea because I was judged, but not much because I had no idea who was going to win or why. But they were actually indifferent to an audience, and that's the real thing that Jerry Cambridge is talking about. You do not publish your poetry as some kind of preening or of some kind of way of getting the regard of others addressed to you. It's an act of communication. It's an act of engagement with an audience. It is an expression which communicates and must reach an audience in some way, which means that it is polite, if not politic, on your part, to actually think about the audience at some point, whether that is the editor. A lot of people get as far as thinking of the editor and second guess the judges or second guess the editor, or whether it is simply the person that they would like to talk to, that they would like their work to reach. To think of that person at all is normally the first sign that they actually are poets in any kind of professional sense whatsoever. And that's the only reason I would suggest why Jerry's saying that, because I've got no reason in the world to deny people expression, the need to express themselves, and I think it should be everyone's gift and right to write poetry and to express themselves as wildly and widely as they can. But there is a moment when you are responsible to an audience, and that moment is as soon as you expect somebody else to read it, as soon as you expect somebody else to give their time up. As you're doing this evening, just to sit here and listen to us waffle on. That as soon as you start doing that, you've got to consider the audience. You've got to begin at some kind of inner dialogue with that audience and think, I've probably gone on long enough with that answer, haven't I? I can see your faces. So, by that token, politely, I draw to a close, because, there it is.
Another extreme of that was where Kathleen Jamie recently said when she was reflecting on being judged in the Dyslexia poetry competition last year, that she felt there had been quite a number of entries who had decided this is the way Kathleen Jamie writes, this is what she's going to like, so I'm going to write Kathleen Jamie's poem. And she made that comment. That sounds like a really bad idea, but that's the other extreme.
That's you confining yourself to an audience of one.
Absolutely. And she wasn't impressed, obviously. And I thought that was
Kathleen.
And really, so these are, in a sense, are the poet's responsibilities. And what in your view makes a really good editor and publisher? And I would like this to be the final question of these, and then I'd like to open to the floor. So.
Okay.
No, I defer. You're an editor and publisher. I defer to.
Well, heavily put upon me. I think mainly is to be open to what isn't fashionable for a start. I mean, this is true. You've got to be able to read work which is completely at odds with what your reading experience is, but good of its kind. And what we said with Waterloo way back in 98, when we started out, was it's got to be good of its kind. It doesn't matter if it's bright and naive, it's Cambridge modernist of a certain type. It's got to be in, and that has produced a very heterodox sort of, and a very heterogeneous range of poets that we've published. And I think that's only for the good, that we get some reputation for, you've got some intellectual modernists here. But I said, have you read X, Y, Z? And of course they haven't. And they find out that we're publishing people who are, not educated in any conventional stance. they haven't got any kind of interest even in a certain type of mainstream poetry. It might be interesting to contemporary poetry, but it's not the stuff you look at. So that's one thing, just to remain open, because there is what I find is one of my pet hatreds, and this, I mean, Bill knows about this as well, and this is about, for instance, editing a magazine. We had something called Erratica, which has had its own story. I don't think we've got time for that now. But anyway, I always was saying something good of its kind. You get the magazines to write back and say, I imagine this is probably anathema to you as well, this is not the kind of right thing for our magazine. Either, do they really hate this stuff, or don't really like it, or they're not really fond of it? Why not just say what it is that you find wrong? And of course that gets you in a long dialogue and the potential people will come back to you. Or the other thing is, we've got a grey house style where the magazine starts thinking you and starts editing you, and you become part of the grey matter of the magazine. And you're no longer actually an editor, you're some kind of sort of, you know, sort of gauleiter for whatever monster you put in place of yourself. So no, you've got to be open, and you've got to produce some and if you don't keep opening to what is utterly weird and challenging to yourself, then it's the time to close down as an editor, at least in that way.
I agree with that very strongly. There are two kinds of editors in my experiences of being edited. I don't know which one I am. One is the kind of editor who is continually trying to second guess posterity. Saying, well, this is good, but it won't last. In 50 years, people will be talking about this, and they are the kind of prophetic controllers of our destiny. And the other type of editors are those who simply would like to know what's going to happen next. And who read in that kind of open sense of, well, I'm really excited to find out what's going to happen. And those kinds of editors tend to be able to read things that are not to their taste, and discover something about their taste, and discover something about how they can develop their taste. And obviously I'm temperamentally inclined towards the second type of editor, which is what I believe I have a blood at, rather than the first kind of editor, who I think is a shaper of the poet rather than an enabler of the poet. So again, it depends what you want, it depends what you're after as a writer. Do you require shaping, or would you prefer enabling?
These are some very interesting points. I would like to open this to the floor now. Is there anything that people would like to ask of either or both? Yes, sorry, Lindsay.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think the wider kind of commercial infrastructure around poetry is doing for or against publishing at the moment, around festivals, creative writing outlets, readings and so on, and what direction out of that is supporting the widening of possibilities within publishing, or perhaps constraining it in any way?
I think there are certainly new things turning up. I mean, a wonderful accident today, I found out that most have left some of the books at the house. So that, for instance, here's an accident, I've only got about one or two, because these are for sale as well, of a particular edition. And I think, well, the perils of getting books up and around and so on is one of the problems. I don't know if you noticed that remix isn't there, you've only got the alternative text.
I can't tell the difference.
I tried, I spent on Saturday evening, I had the two parallel, anyway, that's right, by the by, but I think festivals and selling books is certainly one of the best ways forward. For me, bookshops have died, except City Books in Brighton, I mentioned, because you'd spend a long time chasing people up, and they'll spend a long time fighting you at the various bookshops in the Shires or something. So the bookshops have in a sense done to themselves. The Arts Council, in fairness, John Hampson from the Arts Council was telling us back in 2001, really the bookshops are not even doing a favour 2 or 3 titles, they're just doing the lead title and that's it. There's lots of commercial pressures. People don't buy books, often in poetry bookshops, and you have to have a dedicated place to buy them. So that's a real problem for them, and I sympathise with their own commercial pressures. I think festivals and places like selling, where you've got the festival, you've got the poet signing, obviously there's a bumps there. But the biggest thing is selling online, and that makes a difference. We sell everything online. And the other thing we're finding, e-books are being bought. We sell bizarrely volume to China, to South America, everywhere else, but we're also now selling that volume, the e-book, and indeed the McLeod is going off to the States, where actually to send out one of those volumes is almost as much, again, that to actually send out that single volume to America as it is, as the actual price of the book. and they're pretty modest prices. We kept our prices down. So I think that the e-book is going to make a difference, and we're getting a passive revenue stream, which is going to help. It's going to help basically the printed matter, because those things, you don't have to do anything about it, and you get just under £10, and it drops in from Amazon, and that's fine. But other things, Amazon itself as a trader is incredibly rapacious. So all the small presses, we've got something called Honest Publishing, which has come up with the small presses, and we don't sort of involve ourselves with Amazon in that sense. They might want to sell second-hand book or something, that's up to them. But there are ways now of fighting back, and of fighting with the small presses alongside each other, also not stepping on each other's toes too much, and cooperating, and so on. E-books are going to make a difference, and they will provide a stream to allow these things to exist as well. I think the other one is libraries, and one day when we have governments that actually want to encourage learning as opposed to the bottom-lighting of the body to become, epsilons, we may get back a university budget that will be allowed to purchase volumes of poetry, because that's actually, I have to say, it's rather like the American campuses, which I know are in some respects isolated, but the American openness towards things and the campuses, and Canada as well, is quite striking. And it may well be that some of the universities in Britain will follow, to the extent at least of providing lightning rods for production, dissemination of poetry. I know that sounds like it's ghettoising it, but that to some extent is a help to us, because we have got other things like festivals that go on that the American market doesn't have in the same way, and that's also good.
I would just add to that publishing is simply one point in a range of activities which is now understood to be that which the poetry writer and reader does. So just the act of buying and reading a book is one act. The act of going to a festival, either to deliver or to listen to somebody, is another, an almost equivalent or equal act. The use of new media of Facebook, Twitter, and so forth to follow, to read, to comment is another act. The attending of workshops or engagement with creative writing, whether at universities or through writing in residence or libraries again, is another act. And there is a kind of 5 or 6 point start, which is the ordinary activity of being interested in poetry. And I'm afraid that that we have to accept that each of these has got equal validity, and each of them is taking part in a democracy of actions. I've probably got more Twitter followers than buy my books, and they wouldn't buy my books, but they're quite happy to read me on Twitter, and I have to take that audience as seriously, therefore, as I would take the audience of people who stump up for the books, And so that's come back right at the start of what we were saying about the things do not waste away. They are augmented. They're constantly augmented. Some things die, but most things carry on. That's just how poetry is at the moment. It's always going to be one of those art forms that absorbs other ways of working and other ways of interacting than the straightforward commercial transaction. Because at the straightforward commercial transaction, it is a failure.
Is there anything else I would like to say? I'm conscious of time.
Yes. I was just interested in Simon talking about survivor's poetry. Do you handle that differently from?
Yeah, it's very different in that sense. I mean, it's about people who survive of mental distress, and there are actually some very distinguished poets who are mentors, some ditto who are mentees, people who have been mentored, and there are quite a range of poets. I got through the poster book, because I suppose I was director, Salima Hill, who's gone public on her own bipolar experiences, and I just got this compliments of Salima Hill sent by Bloodaxe, and I thought, I just came for the post just as I was about to set off. And there is a community of people who are interested in that. I mean, Jeffrey Hill has certainly come on public with this. So that is a hidden community of people who have suffered mental distress and have written about it. But in terms of the standards, we have something called Poetry Express, not my title, we inherited it, there's nothing we can do about it. But we do that once a month, and we've got a lot of very interesting opinion, we've got a lot of critical opinion, which is very, very finely wrought. And we have poems which are obviously very different. We have Thomas Orsag-Land, a very well-known translator, producing poetry and translations. We have people who are just beginning to find their voice. And yes, of course, there is a difference in that kind of work. but we do edit, we do suggest. The mentoring schemes are something totally different, but about mentoring people. I know that there's going to be a big interview on this, and maybe the best thing is to
Yes,
suggest.
I think, yes, that will be coming, so there will be further
a
on
long
that.
talk about this.
And so just watch this space, or watch this cyberspace, that one is coming.
Yes.
So,
We do have mentored volumes and mentees and mentors, and we have complete volumes coming out too. And those are of really good quality. They can be sent off to PBS. That's a different experience too, but they're all there. Yes.
Yes, I'm just saying that because there is quite a lot of interest in that in Dundee. There's nobody that I know that's involved.
Please write to me.
we are going to have.
Then I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah.
I really would. And basically, Beth will have all the contact details, and so will Gary. So please do write to us.
We'll keep you in the loop about that. So thank you very much. We now move to the next part of the evening, and on this one, here's where we leave behind the world of publishing and get into the meat of the matter, which is the